Hello, my name is Ottaviano Canuto, and I'm a senior fellow at the Policy Center. I'm also a former executive director and vice president at the World Bank, a former executive director at the IMF, and also a former vice president at the Inter-American Development Bank. Last week was my 23rd consecutive week attending the World Bank and IMF spring meetings in Washington, D.C. I no longer take part in the official sessions, but I'm still invited to the many side conventions and debates that take place around them. Special attention this year was given to the release of the IMF's World Economic Outlook report. It received special attention this year due to the curiosity over how the institution would project the impacts of the tariff war initiated by Mr. Trump's second administration. The IMF downgraded its global growth forecast by half a percentage point to 2.8% for this year and lowered its 2026 forecast to 3%. This represents a slowdown from the 3.3% growth rate in 2024, with the fund warning of the major negative shock from rising trade barriers. The forecast factored in the tariff announcements from the U.S. and retaliatory measures from other countries between February 1st and April 4th. That is to say, before Mr. Trump's announced 90-day pause on most of his so-called reciprocal tariffs, while simultaneously increasing tariffs in China. The fund cut its projections for the U.S. In terms of growth for 2025 to 1.8%, down from the previous 2.7% projection, and also to 1.7% in 2026. While this still keeps the U.S. as the fastest growing G7 economy for this year and next, it marks a clear drop from the 2028 expansion seen in 2024. The IMF also downgraded growth projections for all other G7 countries, as well as for other major economies, including China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. In the case of China, the IMF expects it to slow down its growth. It forecasts 4% growth for both this year and next, compared to 5% in 2024. Brazil's real GDP growth forecast was lowered to 2% for both 2025 and 2026. Among G20 countries, only Turkey, Argentina, and Russia showed improved growth projections. Well, another report also calling attention was the IMF's Global Financial Stability Report. Special attention was given to it because of the financial market turbulence since the start of this month, of April. The report concluded that risks to markets have increased significantly since the White House tariff moves, with a sell-off in U.S. equities and government debt contributing to a tightening of financial conditions as shown in the chart. Well, and the announcement of the reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd had an immediate negative impact on stock markets, as you can see on the right side of this chart. And starting on April 7, we also start seeing similar effects in the U.S. government bond markets. We started witnessing something very much uncommon, at least in the case of the U.S. That is to say, in the case of the U.S., yields on 10-year Treasury bonds rising while the dollar depreciated. This we have seen previously, typically in situations of emerging markets facing capital flight. And indeed, it looked like global portfolios began shedding U.S. assets. Well, those market moves reflected, to a large extent, a shift in perception about who has Mr. Trump's ear. Up until the announcement of the massive reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd, it was believed that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's view prevailed. That is to say that Mr. Trump's tariffs were mainly transactional tools for negotiation purpose. This had been the case with Mexico during Mr. Trump's first term, as well as many believed it would be the early announcements regarding Canada and Mexico during his second term. But the shock came on April 2nd, when it became apparent that the dominant logic might be pure and simple protectionism. With the rise of Mr. Howard Lutnick's Secretary of Commerce, Peter Navarro's, and Mr. Jameson Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative, as the main dominant views on Mr. Trump's trade direction. So then, markets shift focus to the damaging real economy and financial impacts highlighted in the two IMF reports this week. It was no coincidence that the 90-day postponement of the reciprocal tariffs, despite the Chinese-specific increase, came during Mr. Bessent's presence at the White House. The brief market relief that followed reflected renewed hope that the transactional approach might prevail. Chaos in the bond markets was temporarily reinforced by Mr. Trump's threat to fire Federal Reserve Governor Jeremy Powell, a threat that was denied earlier this week. The escalation of tariffs and other retaliatory measures from China seem to have caught up the Trump administration by some surprise. Remarkably, it is, the U.S. intensified the tariff war with China without minimum preparation for realities such as the fact that China currently processes over 90% of critical minerals and magnets necessary for digital products. So a high-stakes game of bluff, a poker game, if you want it, seems to have been established between the U.S. and Chinese governments. Mr. Trump and Mr. Bessent speak of negotiations between the two countries, while the Chinese insist that talks can only begin once the U.S. rolls back the specific new measures targeting China. And indeed, as you can see in this chart, the daily data for container traffic from China to the U.S. seems to be already collapsing. On Tuesday, April 22nd, Secretary Scott Bessent said at a conference organized by J.P. Morgan that he hoped the two countries would eventually reach an agreement, noting that a trade war with China was unsustainable, his words. On Friday, April 25th, there were reports that China's Ministry of Commerce was reviewing sectors affected by Beijing's 125 tariffs on U.S. products. Meanwhile, although Mr. Trump claimed the Chinese President Xi Jinping had called him, Beijing denied that any negotiations to ease trade tensions between the world's two large economies had started. I know people in China who have told me about government campaigns encouraging the population to endure the economic pain expected from the tariff war's impact on China's exports and growth. Another hot topic last week was with respect to Mr. Trump's relationship with multilateral institutions. Remember that one of Mr. Trump's first executive orders was a review of those relationships with a report due in August. Last year, a report from the influential conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, even proposed then that the U.S. should withdraw from the Bretton Woods institutions. At one of the side events during this week's IMF World Bank spring meetings, hosted by the Institute of International Finance, Secretary Scott Bessent did not call for an exit, but emphasized tying U.S. contributions to a shift in institutional focus. He criticized the IMF and World Bank for mission drift, mission creeps, in fact, demanding they steer away from extensive and unfocused agendas like climate change and gender issues. Well, going back to the IMF and World Bank's the IMF report of last week, they also outlined less pessimistic scenarios in case negotiations between the U.S. and its major trading partners lead to tariff reductions. According to Mr. Tobias Adrian, director of the IMF's Monetary and Capital Markets Department, although the negative effects of tariffs have already been somewhat priced in, equity and bond price could certainly fall further if negotiations fail. So it's either successful negotiations or further stress and downgrades. Last wish for the best after such a spring of tariff regret. Thank you. Keep tuned.